The quiet buzz of a small cafe in downtown Los Angeles filled the air as the aroma of freshly brewed coffee blended with the soft hum of casual conversations. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, a refuge for those seeking a peaceful moment in the hustle and bustle of city life. Keanu Reeves, sitting at a corner table with a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, stared out the window, enjoying the serenity. His mind drifted, lost in the rhythm of the world outside, when a sudden disturbance shattered the calm. The door of the cafe swung open with a force that turned heads. A biker, tall and imposing in his black leather jacket, strode in with a purpose. His heavy boots hit the floor like a thunderclap, and his presence alone was enough to make everyone in the room pause. His eyes scanned the room, and they landed on a small table by the window, where a young mother and her daughter, no older than 6, sat enjoying a quiet breakfast. Before anyone could react, the biker stormed toward them, his face twisted with anger, his jaw clenched as he muttered something under his breath. The little girl, oblivious to the brewing storm, giggled as she sipped her hot tea. Her mother, looking up, tried to smile at the biker, but the cold glare he shot her made her instantly tense. The next moment was nothing short of shocking. Without any warning, the biker reached over, grabbed the hot tea from the table, and, with a swift motion, hurled it directly at the little girl. The liquid splashed across her face and chest, burning her delicate skin. A collective gasp filled the cafe. The mother screamed, leaping from her chair, trying to shield her daughter, but the damage had already been done. Emma, the little girl, sobbed, her tiny hands frantically trying to wipe away the tea, her eyes wide with pain and confusion. In the chaos, one person remained unusually calm, Keanu Reeves. His gaze shifted from the biker to the terrified mother and daughter. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the tension in the cafe rose to a boiling point. But then, Keanu stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing with quiet resolve. It was clear that he wasn't about to let this injustice slide. "Hey!" Keanu's voice cut through the tension, calm yet firm, as he took a few steps toward the biker. Everyone in the cafe watched in stunned silence. The biker, momentarily distracted, turned toward Keanu with an irritated sneer. "Mind your business, buddy," the biker growled, ready to escalate the situation even further. But Keanu wasn't backing down. He stood his ground unwavering, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the biker's rage. "That's enough," Keanu said, his voice low but filled with authority. What happened next would shock everyone, and no one could have predicted it. If you're as intrigued as we are about what happens next, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss the wild turn this story is about to take. As the biker stood face to face with Keanu, the tension in the cafe felt almost unbearable. But while everyone in the room was still trying to process what had just happened, it was important to understand how things had escalated to this point. Each of the characters involved had a story, one that led them to this pivotal moment. The biker, whose name was Jake, was no stranger to anger. Standing at 6'4", with a broad frame and a face hardened by years of turmoil, he looked every bit the part of the menacing figure he portrayed. He wore a worn-out leather jacket with patches representing the motorcycle club he was part of. His rough exterior was matched by a deep inner turmoil that had haunted him for years. Jake hadn't always been this way. There was a time when he was a kind-hearted man, a son to loving parents and a friend to many. But life had a way of throwing curveballs. His parents had died in a car accident when he was in his late 20s, and the grief had eaten him alive. His response to the pain was to dive headfirst into the world of motorcycles and rebellious living. The clubs he joined offered camaraderie, but with it came a deepening bitterness towards the world around him. Over time, anger became his only companion. With every bar fight and harsh word exchanged, Jake built walls around his heart, convinced that showing any vulnerability would only make him weaker. But deep down, he was a man who longed for connection, even if he refused to admit it. The problem was, his rage had become a shield that was about to be tested in the most unexpected way. Emma was everything Jake was not. At just 6 years old, she had a bright, carefree smile that lit up the room. Her world was full of wonder, from the smell of freshly baked cookies to the soft hum of her mother's voice. as they shared moments like these having breakfast at the cafe. Emma's mother, Laura, had always made sure that Emma felt safe and loved. Their bond was unbreakable. Laura had worked hard to provide for Emma after her husband passed away a few years ago, and though their lives were far from luxurious, they were filled with the joy of simple things. On that fateful morning, as they sat together sipping tea, Emma had no idea that her world was about to be turned upside down. She was simply enjoying the morning, unaware of the storm that was brewing right beside her, and in a split second, that innocence was shattered by the unprovoked attack. But Emma was not one to back down. The tear in her eye was more from confusion than pain, her small fingers trembling as she tried to wipe away the hot tea. She looked to her mother for comfort, but also for understanding. Why had this happened? It wasn't the first time she had seen someone angry, but it was the first time someone's anger had touched her so personally. And then there was Keanu Reeves. At first glance, he seemed like just another quiet customer in the cafe. He was dressed casually, blending in with the other patrons who were lost in their own worlds. But beneath the calm exterior lay a man who had seen more than his fair share of hardship. Keanu was no stranger to personal loss. His early years in Hollywood had been filled with success, but also immense pain. He had lost his closest friend. River Phoenix at a young age, and his personal life had been marked by heartache and sorrow. Yet through it all, Keanu had remained grounded. It was his quiet strength and innate sense of justice that drew him into the situation that day. Keanu had always believed in protecting the vulnerable, whether it was through his roles in films or in his own life. The moment he witnessed the biker's attack on the young girl, something deep within him stirred. He could no longer remain silent. The cafe's atmosphere, once calm and tranquil, had now shifted to an unsettling tension. Every eye in the room was fixed on Jake and Keanu as the seconds ticked by. The biker, towering over Keanu, was visibly frustrated. His hand still clenched into a fist, the leather of his jacket creaking as he shifted his weight, glaring at Keanu as though daring him to do something. Keanu, however, remained calm, his eyes steady and unwavering. There was no hint of fear in his posture. He could feel the heat of the situation. He could see the pain in Emma's eyes and the distress on her mother's face. But Keanu knew that sometimes silence could speak louder than words. His presence alone, his quiet resolve, was enough to make everyone in the cafe take a step back, unsure of what might come next. The biker took a step forward, his boots striking the floor with a thud that reverberated through the room. "What, you think you're going to stop me?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. His eyes narrowed, challenging Keanu's calm demeanor. "You don't know who you're dealing with, buddy." Keanu didn't flinch. His voice was firm, yet measured. "What's your problem with her?" he asked, nodding towards Emma, who was now sitting in her mother's lap, her face still wet with tea. Jake's nostrils flared as his anger built up. He hadn't expected to be questioned, especially not by someone like Keanu Reeves, of all people. "Mind your own business," Jake snapped, his fists clenched tighter. His frustration had begun to bubble over, the anger that had consumed him for years threatening to boil over. Laura, Emma's mother, had been silently watching this exchange, her heart pounding in her chest. She was terrified, not just for her daughter, but for herself. What could she do to stop this? How could she protect Emma? She wasn't physically strong enough to challenge the biker, and her only hope was in Keanu. She reached out, a quiet plea in her eyes. "I don't know what your problem is," Keanu continued, his voice cutting through the tension. "But this ends now." His tone was not one of confrontation, but of resolve. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let Jake destroy the peace in this cafe or hurt an innocent child. Jake's lips curled into a sneer. "And what if I don't want it to end? What if I like this?" The room was still, holding its breath. Keanu's gaze never wavered. His presence, calm and collected, was like a pillar of stability amidst the chaos. He took a small step forward, narrowing the gap between them. "You can keep pretending to be tough, but hurting a child, that's a line you don't cross," Keanu said, his voice low. But there was an unmistakable strength in it. The tension reached a breaking point. Jake, his mind clouded with frustration, was ready to lash out again. He took another step toward Keanu, his fists now visibly trembling with rage. Everyone in the cafe held their breath, waiting for the inevitable conflict to escalate into violence. Would this end in a fight? Would Keanu have to physically intervene? And then, just as the situation seemed like it might spiral out of control, something shifted in the biker's expression. The anger didn't disappear, but the fire behind his eyes seemed to dull, replaced by something else. Doubt. Keanu didn't move. He wasn't trying to fight, he was trying to reach him. "Is this really who you want to be?" Keanu's voice softened, as if speaking directly to the person behind the biker mask. "You're stronger than this." Jake hesitated. He'd heard those words before, in a different context, but they had never sounded so real, so piercing. Was he really the man he had become? Was this his purpose? To destroy those weaker than him? The biker paused, the weight of the question settling in. In that moment, Laura stood up, holding Emma tightly in her arms, her eyes now filled with a fierce determination. She walked toward the biker, speaking with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "She didn't deserve this. Whatever you've been through, this isn't the way to deal with it." For the first time, Jake looked at Emma, the small, innocent child who had just been attacked without reason. She was still crying softly, but her tear-filled eyes locked onto his, and for a split second he felt a pang of regret. I don't know what's wrong with me," Jake muttered under his breath, the words barely audible. He stepped back, slightly, his anger starting to subside as he processed the weight of the situation. Keanu watched silently, sensing the shift. He didn't push. He simply let the silence speak for him, allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace. The tension is far from over, but what happens now? Will Jake finally take responsibility for his actions? Or will he push back against the moment of realization? Don't miss what happens next. Hit that subscribe button now to find out how this intense situation unfolds. The air in the cafe was thick with tension, but now something had changed. Jake, the biker, stood there, motionless, his fists still clenched, but no longer aimed at the innocent child he had just hurt. The room seemed to hold its breath as every eye was focused on him, waiting for a reaction. Keanu stood his ground, still calm and unwavering, but there was something in his gaze, something unspoken, that spoke volumes. He wasn't just trying to defuse the situation. He was offering Jake a way out. The unspoken message was clear. You can choose to be better, but it was up to Jake to take it. Jake shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his mind racing. His heart pounded in his chest, not from physical exertion, but from the overwhelming wave of conflicting emotions flooding his mind. Anger, regret, shame, and a deep, aching sense of loneliness that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound in the cafe was the soft clink of cups and the hushed whispers from the other patrons, unsure of what was about to happen next. Even Emma had stopped crying, her wide eyes locked on Jake with a mix of fear and curiosity. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, Jake spoke. His voice was rough, hoarse, and unrecognizable from the brash tone he'd used earlier. I'm sorry," he muttered, the words escaping him reluctantly as though they didn't quite fit in his mouth. Laura, still clutching Emma in her arms, blinked in surprise. It wasn't the apology she had expected or wanted, but it was something. Her gaze softened slightly, though caution remained in her eyes. I didn't mean to," Jake continued, his head hanging low now, his anger giving way to something else entirely. Vulnerability. "I've been messed up for so long. I didn't know how to handle anything. It's all been too much." Keanu's expression didn't change, but the tiniest flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. He'd seen this before, the pain hidden beneath the armor of pride and rage. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, and he wasn't sure how far Jake would go, but at least there was a chance now. A chance for the man to stop running from his past. Jake shifted again, running a hand through his unruly hair, his face a mask of frustration and confusion. "I lost everything, you know. My parents, everything I loved, I became this. And I thought I thought I'd feel better." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "But I don't. I just hurt people." His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time he looked at Emma, really looked at her, seeing the tear stains on her small cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, quieter this time, his words almost swallowed by the weight of his own guilt. Keanu took a step forward, not in aggression, but in a quiet show of support. "It's never too late to change," he said softly, his voice calm yet full of conviction. "We all make mistakes, but we don't have to keep repeating them." There was a long pause. Jake stood frozen in place, as if the world around him had come to a standstill. The weight of his own past, the people he had hurt, and the choices he had made, all hung heavy in the air. He could feel the pressure, the pull to make things right, even if it seemed like an impossible task. Then slowly, almost as if testing the waters, Jake took a step back. Another, and another. His eyes never left Emma, his expression filled with the complexity of everything. He had just said, everything he was beginning to realize about himself. "I don't expect forgiveness," Jake muttered, his voice raw with emotion. "But I'm going to make this right somehow, I swear." Keanu nodded slowly, as though confirming Jake's unspoken promise to himself. There was still a long road ahead. For Jake, a long journey of redemption and self-forgiveness. But today, for the first time in a long while, he had made the first step. The tension in the cafe had shifted, almost imperceptibly, but enough for the patrons to begin relaxing. The barista, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes, let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The tension that had once filled every corner of the room began to ebb away, replaced with an odd sense of relief. Laura, still holding Emma, took a cautious step toward Jake. "I don't know what you plan to do, but I believe you," she said, her voice steady, though still guarded. "Just don't let this moment slip away." Jake nodded, his eyes filled with something, new determination and a hint of hope. "I won't," he whispered. Keanu gave a small, approving nod before turning back to his seat. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for speeches. Jake had made a choice, and now the hard part would begin. But for now, Keanu could rest easy, knowing that the moment had been enough to make a difference. Not just for Emma or Laura, but for Jake too. The journey is far from over for Jake. Can he truly change? Will he find a way to make things right? Stick around to see where this journey takes him and how the events at the cafe will continue to unfold. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this powerful story. As the days passed, the incident at the cafe became a turning point for everyone involved. Jake, the biker, had gone through a whirlwind of emotions that no one could have predicted. What had started as a simple, almost casual act of aggression had transformed into something much bigger, a confrontation with his own past and a confrontation with the life he had chosen to live. And somehow, it all came down to this. In the quiet aftermath of that day, Jake's mind churned with what Keanu had said. He had thought it was just a random act of kindness, something from a stranger who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But as the hours ticked by, the weight of Keanu's words began to sink in. It's never too late to change. How could that be possible? Could he really change after everything he had done? But there was something else. The look in Emma's eyes. It wasn't the look of a victim, of someone who had been wronged. It was the look of someone who believed, despite everything, that people could be better, that people could be kind. She had forgiven him in the most innocent way possible, without hesitation, without anger. She had simply seen him, not as a villain but as a human being, and that realization was something Jake couldn't shake. He had been walking through life hardened and bitter, thinking that he was incapable of changing. But now he wasn't sure. A glimmer of hope had taken root in his heart. One evening, as Jake sat alone in his dingy apartment, an apartment that mirrored his life in many ways, he stared at the old photo of his parents that sat on the small table beside him. The smiling faces in the picture were so far removed from the person he had become. There was a time when he had been loved, when he had believed in the goodness of the world. That person, The boy in the photo seemed like a distant memory now, a forgotten version of himself, but it was in this moment, surrounded by the silence of his own regret, that Jake finally made the decision. He had to face Emma. He had to apologize. He had to do more than just speak words. He had to show her and everyone else that he was capable of changing. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick, but it was the first step towards something he hadn't thought possible. In years, redemption. Keanu, on the other hand, had left the cafe that day, feeling something he hadn't in a long time: satisfaction. He didn't need the spotlight, the credit, or the recognition, but seeing Jake take that first step, seeing the man look inward and confront his own demons, that was enough. It was moments like these, when human beings made the choice to rise above their worst instincts, that made all of Keanu's struggles worth it. The journey toward personal redemption wasn't a straight line, and Keanu knew that better than anyone. But there was hope in those first steps, even when the path ahead was murky and unclear. He continued to think about Jake in the days that followed, wondering if he would actually follow through on the changes he had promised. There was still a long road ahead for Jake, but Keanu had given him a small spark of hope, one that could potentially grow into something life-changing. And as much as he had tried to avoid the situation, as much as he had tried to remain an observer, Keanu realized something. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He had made a difference, and that was enough. Days later, Jake found himself outside the cafe again. This time his heart was heavy with a mix of anxiety and determination. He stood there, just outside the door, staring at the familiar window. The same place where he had caused the chaos. The same place where, for the first time in years, he had seen a sliver of his own humanity. He took a deep breath before stepping inside. The bell above the door chimed, and the moment Emma's mother, Laura, saw him, she froze. Her initial reaction was one of wariness, but then she saw it. The man standing before her wasn't the same man who had exploded in anger that day. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a softness to his posture that hadn't been there before. I'm here to apologize, Jake stammered, his voice low, almost fragile. I can't undo what I did, but I need you to know that I'm sorry for what happened to Emma. I've never been proud of the things I've done, but what I did to her, that's something I'll never forgive myself for. Emma, who had been sitting quietly at a table, looked up at Jake. Her eyes were still filled with that same innocence, that same forgiveness. She didn't flinch when their gazes met. Instead, she simply nodded, as if she understood that this moment was bigger than both of them. I've been angry for a long time, Jake continued, his voice now steadier, and I let that anger control me. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to. I want to be better. Laura looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then, to everyone's surprise, she said, "It's a start." The room was silent, save for the clink of a spoon against a cup as someone stirred their drink. Jake's apology wasn't dramatic or extravagant, but it was sincere. It was the first time he had truly taken responsibility for his actions, and the weight of that truth hung in the air. It wasn't a complete resolution. There was still a lot of work to do, but it was a beginning. The emotional climax wasn't about an explosive moment. It was about quiet realization, the kind that slowly but surely begins to heal old wounds. Keanu, still sitting quietly at a corner table, saw the exchange between Jake and Emma. He didn't need to say anything. The decision had been made. Jake was starting down a long road to redemption, but this was the moment where it all began. Jake has taken his first step towards redemption, but the journey is far from over. Will he succeed in changing his ways? And what about the others around him? Will they believe in him? Stay with us for the next chapter as we continue to explore the powerful choices these characters make. Don't forget to subscribe to see what happens next. The days after Jake's apology were a blur of emotions, mostly hope and uncertainty. His life had taken a turn, but the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. He had made his apology. He had made a commitment to change, but that was only the beginning. Redemption wasn't a one-time action. It was a continuous process. But something inside him had shifted, and he couldn't ignore it. Jake knew that to make real change in his life, he needed to confront his past, really face the pain he had been running from. The anger that had defined him for so long had been his shield, but now it had to become his catalyst for change. One afternoon, Jake stood in front of a small, nondescript building, a local support group for people who had struggled with anger issues, addiction, and personal trauma. It had taken every ounce of courage to walk through the door. The biker jacket that had once been a symbol of defiance now felt like a burden on his shoulders, weighing him down. But this was his choice, his step forward. He pushed the door open, the soft chime of a bell ringing as he entered. Inside there was a circle of chairs, and people were talking quietly to one another. They stopped when Jake walked in, and for a moment the room was silent. Is this the group for people trying to change? Jake asked, his voice unsure but steady. The group leader, a calm woman with soft eyes, smiled warmly. You're in the right place, she said, gesturing for him to sit. We're here to help each other through the tough times. Jake nodded, the knot in his stomach tightening. This was the hardest thing he had ever done, but he had to be here. He had to be willing to look at himself, not the image he had projected onto the world, but the real person beneath it all. For the next hour, Jake listened as people shared their stories of loss, regret, and growth. Some of them had been through far worse than he could imagine, yet they were there, speaking honestly about their struggles and their hopes for the future. When it came time for Jake to speak, he felt his throat tighten. He had never been good at being vulnerable, never good at showing weakness. But this wasn't about pride anymore. I'm Jake, he began, his voice low. I've hurt people. I've hurt a lot of people, and I don't know how to fix it. I've been angry for so long, and I don't know how to stop being that person. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. But I'm here because I want to change. I don't want to keep living like this. There was a long pause. Then someone from the circle nodded. It's not easy, she said, but you took the first step. That's something. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the smallest flicker of hope ignite inside him. The group didn't judge him. They accepted him, just as he was. For the first time, in a long while, he didn't feel alone. Meanwhile, Keanu sat alone in his apartment, a cup of coffee resting in front of him on the table. His mind wandered back to the café, back to the encounter with Jake. It had been a chaotic moment, full of tension and uncertainty, but something had shifted. Keanu had witnessed a man, someone who had been hardened by years of anger and pain, begin to break free from his own prison. Keanu had seen this transformation before. He had seen people, himself included, struggle with their pasts and try to find a way forward. It wasn't always easy and it wasn't always quick, but it was possible. Jake had taken that first step, and for Keanu that was enough. It was a sign that people could change, that anyone could change if they were willing to face their demons head-on. The image of Emma, sitting there at the cafe with her mother, her innocent eyes locked onto Jake's, stayed with Keanu. She had forgiven him without question, without hesitation. She had given him a gift, a chance for redemption, and now it was up to Jake to accept it. Keanu smiled softly to himself. Sometimes, it was the smallest gestures that made the biggest impact. He hadn't known it at the time, but in that one moment, by simply standing up to Jake and showing him that there was another way, Keanu had been a catalyst for something bigger than himself. He had given Jake the space to reflect, to change, and that was all anyone could ask for. Back at the cafe, life had returned to normal almost. Emma continued to visit with her mother, always greeted by the same warm smile from the barista. But there was something different now. There was a quiet understanding in the air, a recognition that people could be better, even when they didn't deserve it. One afternoon, as Emma and her mother sat at their usual table, Emma looked up at her mother and asked, "Do you think Jake will be okay, Mom?" Laura paused, her eyes softening as she looked at her daughter. "I think he's trying, sweetie, and that's all we can ask for." Emma smiled and nodded. She didn't understand everything about what had happened, but she knew enough to believe in the goodness of people. She had seen it in Jake's eyes when he had apologized, and she had seen it in her mother, who had shown compassion even when it was difficult. For Emma, the world was still a place full of possibilities. She still believed in kindness, in the power of forgiveness, and in the chance for people to change. And as long as she had that belief, there was hope. Jake continued to attend the support group. Each session, each conversation, felt like another step forward. He wasn't perfect, and he knew he never would be, but he was trying. He was doing the hard work of facing the parts of himself that he had long ignored. And for the first time in years, he was starting to feel a sense of peace. A peace that came from knowing he didn't have to carry the weight of his past forever. For Keanu, he moved forward in his own way, knowing that his small act of intervention had sparked a change in someone's life. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about recognition. It was about the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes just being there for someone was enough. The cafe remained a place of refuge for many, Emma and her mother, Jake, and even Keanu, who came to realize that the greatest stories weren't the ones played out on the big screen, but the ones unfolding right in front of us. The quiet, everyday acts of kindness, of redemption, of people trying to be better. These were the moments that truly mattered. Jake's journey toward redemption continues, but the question remains, will he stay on the path he has started? And will others, like Keanu, continue to influence the lives of those around them? Keep following along to see how the story unfolds. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on every new chapter. The days since Jake's first steps toward redemption had been transformative for him, though not without their challenges. He was still learning, still growing, and he knew there was a long way to go. But every day he spent in that support group, every time he took responsibility for his actions, he felt the weight of his past beginning to lift. He was no longer trapped by anger, regret, or self-pity. Instead, he was slowly becoming someone he could finally be proud of. It was during one of those evenings when he found himself sitting at the same café where everything had started. He wasn't there to apologize or to find redemption from the others. He was simply there for a moment of peace, a moment of reflection. It had become a quiet haven for him. The clink of coffee cups, the soft hum of conversation in the background. It was a place where he felt safe to be himself. As Jake sat by the window, watching the evening light fade into dusk, he couldn't help but think about all that had changed. It wasn't just about his personal growth. It was about the people who had shown him kindness, the people who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. It was about Emma, who had offered him her forgiveness in a way that no one else ever had. And it was about Keanu, who had started the whole thing, not with grand gestures, but with a simple act of kindness, a gesture that had set everything in motion. Jake took a sip of his coffee, allowing the warmth to soothe his nerves. He had just received a message from his mother, telling him she was proud of the work he was doing, proud of how far he had come. For the first time in years, he truly felt her pride. It wasn't just because he was trying to fix things, it was because he was actually changing. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Laura, Emma's mother. She simply said, "Emma wanted to know how you're doing. She says she believes in you." Jake smiled softly. Emma's words were a constant reminder to him that change was not just about fixing mistakes. It was about the effort to keep going, to keep moving forward, even when it felt impossible. Her faith, in him as simple as it was, had been a lifeline. Keanu had been right. There was hope for everyone, even those who felt lost in their own darkness. And the power of forgiveness, whether given by a 6-year-old girl or a stranger, could heal wounds that seemed too deep to fix. Jake leaned back in his chair, reflecting on everything that had led him here. His journey wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was his. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a prisoner of his past. There was no magic formula for redemption, no quick fix, but the journey, the small steps, the continuous effort, that was what mattered. He looked around the cafe, and for the first time, he truly saw the people around him. They weren't strangers. They were fellow travelers in this strange, unpredictable journey called life. Some were fighting their own battles, some were just trying to survive, and some, like him, were learning to be better people. Keanu had played his part. He had stepped in at the right moment, not to save Jake, but to guide him towards saving himself. And Jake was doing just that. He wasn't perfect, and there would be days when the weight of his past would feel heavy again. But now he had the tools to carry it. He had the support, the belief, and most of all, the desire to keep going. As Jake finished his coffee, he stood up, stretching his legs. He looked out the window, where the last rays of the sun were slipping below the horizon. The world outside was filled with possibilities, both for him and for everyone else. It was a reminder that life didn't stop. It kept going with or without you. And Jake was ready to keep going with it. Before leaving the cafe, he took a moment to glance around, a small smile forming on his lips. He wasn't just passing through anymore. He was living and he was changing. Maybe that was enough for now. Meanwhile, across the room, Keanu sat quietly, his eyes following Jake as he stood up to leave. He didn't need to speak, to intervene, or to make a grand gesture. He knew that the seed had been planted, and the growth was happening. Jake's journey wasn't over, but it had changed course, and that was a victory in itself. Keanu took one last sip of his coffee and stood up. He walked out of the cafe, stepping into the evening air. It was a new day, one filled with the promise of more transformations, more acts of kindness, and more people taking their first steps toward a better life. Now that you've seen Jake's journey, we want to hear from you. If you were in Jake's shoes, what would you do next? What would it take for you to make that first step toward change? And for those of you who believe in the power of forgiveness and transformation, what's the most meaningful act of kindness you've ever experienced? We invite you to share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories and see how they connect with Jake's journey. And remember, no matter where you are in your own life, it's never too late to take that first step. The road to redemption, growth, and self-improvement is never easy, but it's always worth it. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us continue to bring you stories of hope, redemption, and the power of change. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us. Stay tuned for more incredible stories coming soon. The sun was setting over the city, casting a warm golden glow across the streets. Jake stood on the balcony of his small apartment, looking out at the world, a soft breeze ruffling his hair. His hands, which had once been clenched into fists, were now relaxed at his sides. He wasn't the same person who had walked into that cafe months ago. It had been a long, winding road to get here, but he was finally starting to feel like he could breathe again. He thought about how much had changed, how many small, seemingly insignificant moments had led to this new chapter in his life. It wasn't just the apology to Emma or his decision to attend that support group. It was the countless nights spent reflecting on his past, the hard conversations with his mother, the feeling of vulnerability that had once terrified him, but was now a part of who he was. Jake had come to realize that redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about acknowledging them, learning from them, and doing better. It was a process, an ongoing one, that he had to choose every single day. In the months that followed, Jake made significant strides. He continued attending the support group, where he shared his struggles, his successes, and his setbacks. He no longer felt like an outsider. He was part of something bigger, a community of people who understood the weight of their pasts and the power of change. He had also started volunteering at the local shelter, helping others who were struggling with issues he knew all too well: anger, addiction, and the feeling of being lost. It wasn't always easy, but it was rewarding. For the first time, he wasn't running from his past. He was using it to help others. Each day felt like a small victory. And as he continued to grow, he began to rebuild his relationships with those who had once been closest to him. His mother, his friends, those bridges that had been damaged by his past behavior were slowly being repaired brick by brick. Keanu, on the other hand, had returned to his usual routine. His days were filled with acting, travel, and the occasional quiet moment to himself. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in him as well. It wasn't just about the act of stepping in when he had. It was the realization that he had made a difference, something he hadn't expected, but had deeply appreciated. Keanu's role in Jake's transformation had been small, but it had been a turning point. He hadn't tried to save Jake. He had simply offered a hand, shown kindness, and that had been enough. He often thought about the moments in life when a single act of kindness could set someone on a path of change. And, like Jake, Keanu realized that sometimes you didn't need grand gestures to make an impact. It was the little things, like choosing to listen, choosing to act, choosing to be there, that really mattered. It was one evening while Keanu was walking through a park that the realization truly hit him. He had always focused on his career, his fame, and the roles he played on screen. But in the last few months, he had come to understand that real life wasn't about the roles we took on in front of a camera. It was about the roles we played in the lives of the people around us. He had been a catalyst in Jake's life, but Jake had made the real change. It was an empowering thought. Keanu had always known that change was possible. But seeing it in action, watching it unfold in someone else's life, was a reminder that we all had the power to make a difference. No matter how small or seemingly insignificant that difference might seem at first. Meanwhile, Emma had continued to thrive, as children often do, with the innocence and simplicity that only a young heart could possess. She still visited the café with her mother, her eyes always full of wonder and hope. She had asked her mother about Jake many times, and Laura had explained to her that people could change, and that everyone deserved a second chance. Emma didn't fully understand all the complexities of life. She didn't need to, but she believed in the goodness of people, and that belief had influenced everyone around her, especially Jake. The innocence of her forgiveness, the purity of her faith in him, had been the catalyst that sparked his journey. Jake knew that he would carry that gift of forgiveness with him forever. He could never forget how a 6-year-old girl, with nothing but her open heart, had helped to change his life. Her belief in him was something he would never take for granted. Jake's story wasn't over, and neither was Keanu's. Both men had learned that life wasn't about living for the applause or the accolades. It was about living with integrity, kindness, and purpose. And even though they came from different worlds, they both shared the understanding that sometimes the greatest rewards in life came from the quiet, unspoken moments of growth and connection. The future was still unknown, but Jake was no longer afraid of it. He had a new foundation to build upon, a new sense of self-worth, and a new community of people who supported him. And Keanu, for his part, would continue to be the person who quietly observed, who stepped in when needed, and who believed in the power of change. In the end, they both understood that life wasn't about achieving perfection. It was about making progress, no matter how slow or difficult it might be. They knew that the road would continue to be challenging, but it would also be filled with the kind of moments that made it all worthwhile. So, what about you? Have you ever experienced a moment in your life where someone's simple act of kindness made a difference? Or perhaps you've been the one who made that difference for someone else. We want to hear your stories. Whether big or small, acts of kindness have the power to create a ripple effect that can change lives. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How has someone's belief in you helped you grow? Or how has your belief in someone else impacted their journey? And if you've enjoyed Jake's journey so far, be sure to like and subscribe to keep following his story. We've got more chapters ahead, filled with heartwarming moments, lessons learned, and the ever-present possibility of change. Let's continue this journey together. Stay tuned. The city had changed in subtle ways. For Jake, it felt like the world around him had somehow shifted, as if everything was now in place. He no longer felt the weight of his mistakes like a heavy anchor, dragging him back into his old self. The past was still there, but it no longer defined him. He stood in front of the small community center, a place that had become a second home for him. The center wasn't glamorous, but it was full of people who had shared experiences, people who had come together to help each other grow. It had become a refuge, a place where Jake could contribute, where his past mistakes didn't define him but his present actions did. Today was a special day. Jake had been asked to speak at a community event, sharing his journey with others who were still in the midst of their own struggles. He had no idea how many people would show up, but for him this was more than just an opportunity to speak. It was a chance to give back. Jake stood in front of the small crowd, his palms sweating, Slightly. He had never been one for public speaking. In fact, the thought of speaking in front of a group would have paralyzed him a few months ago. But now there was a sense of purpose in his heart. He knew that if he could inspire just one person to take that first step toward change, it would all be worth it. He cleared his throat and the room fell silent. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of everything he had learned. "I wasn't always the man I am today," Jake began. "In fact, I was the kind of person you might avoid. I let anger control me. I hurt people I loved. I was a mess, but I'm here to tell you that it's never too late to change. You don't have to keep making the same mistakes. You don't have to let your past define your future." As he spoke, he noticed the faces in the crowd. Some were familiar, people he'd met in the support group. Others were new, people who looked like they were still carrying the weight of their own mistakes. "I'm not perfect," Jake continued, "but I've learned that it's okay not to be. What matters is that we keep moving forward. We make the choice to do better, to be better." There was a long pause after Jake finished speaking, a moment where the words seemed to hang in the air. Then, slowly, one person clapped, then another, and soon the entire room was applauding. Jake couldn't help but smile. This was it. This was the kind of moment he had never thought possible, standing in front of a room full of people who understood his struggles, who saw him for who he was now, not who he had been. The event ended, but Jake stayed behind to talk with people. One by one they approached him, sharing their own stories, their own struggles. Some of them had been to jail, some had lost loved ones. Some were just starting to confront the demons they had hidden deep inside for years. For the first time, Jake didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like he was part of something bigger. He wasn't just telling his story. He was helping others find their voice, their strength. It was a feeling of connection he had never known. As he talked with a man named Tom, who had recently lost his job and family, Jake saw a familiar look in his eyes. It was the same look he had seen in the mirror months ago, the look of someone who didn't believe they had a chance anymore. Jake placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "You have a chance, man," he said softly. "You just have to choose it." Tom looked at Jake, his eyes filled with doubt, but also something else, hope. The following afternoon, Jake was sitting at a bench in the community center's garden, enjoying a moment of solitude. He had a lot on his mind, but as he sat there, soaking in the calm, a familiar face appeared in the distance. Keanu Reeves walked toward him, his long stride purposeful, his face as calm and collected as always. Jake blinked, not sure if he was seeing things. "Was this really happening, Keanu?" Jake called out, standing up in surprise. Keanu smiled, the same friendly smile that had first guided him on his path months ago. "Jake, how are you?" Keanu asked, his voice warm and genuine. Jake couldn't help but laugh in disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Keanu shrugged lightly, sitting down beside Jake on the bench. "I wanted to see how you were doing, and I thought, why not visit the guy who helped me realize a few things about myself?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "You? Learn something from me?" Keanu nodded. "Yes, sometimes we all need a reminder about the power of change. You've done something incredible, Jake. I wanted to see it for myself." Jake smiled, feeling a lump in his throat. "I don't know if I've done anything incredible. I'm just trying to do better, you know?" Keanu placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "That's exactly it, and doing better is what counts. You've made a real difference, not just for yourself, but for others too. That's something to be proud of." As they sat there talking quietly about life, Jake realized something important. The path to redemption wasn't about doing one big thing, one dramatic change. It was about the small moments, the everyday decisions to keep going, to keep learning, and to keep growing. Jake had come to realize that there was no end to this journey. Every day would offer new challenges, but it was up to him to meet them head on. And with the people he had in his life, Keanu, the community center, his support group, he knew he was never alone. "Thanks for coming by, Keanu," Jake said, looking at him with gratitude. Keanu smiled. "Any time, Jake. Keep doing what you're doing. I'm proud of you." As Keanu stood up and walked away, Jake watched him go, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. This was just the beginning. The future was waiting, full of unknowns, but Jake was ready. He had faced the hardest part of his journey. He had chosen change, and now he would continue to choose it every day. Now, we want to know, what does your journey of change look like? Have you ever had a moment where you decided to choose a new path, to do better for yourself and the people around you? Or maybe there's someone who made a difference in your life, the way Keanu made a difference in Jake's. If you've been inspired by Jake's story, share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We'd love to hear about your own experiences, struggles and triumphs. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button to follow Jake's journey and to stay updated on more stories of hope, growth, and change. Thanks for being part of this community. The soft hum of the city filled the air, the sounds of people bustling through their daily routines, blending with the rustling of leaves in the trees around Jake's apartment. He stood by his window, looking out over the skyline, his mind swirling. With thoughts of everything he had gone through in the past few months, he had learned more than he ever expected about himself and others. The journey that started with a simple act of kindness had led him here, standing on the brink of a new life. Jake had become a regular face at the community center, continuing to help those who needed support. He spent his days offering guidance to people who, like him, had once felt lost, struggling to find their way in a world that often seemed unforgiving. But more importantly, he had found his own redemption, not in the applause or acknowledgement, but in the quiet moments of change, both in himself and the people he helped. It had been a while since Jake had seen his mother. Their relationship had been fractured for so long, and despite the progress he had made, he couldn't help but feel the lingering pain of their past. There were many things they hadn't said to each other, many apologies left unspoken. But now, sitting across from her at a small cafe, Jake knew that it was time to finally heal those wounds. His mother looked older, her face softer now, the years of worry etched into her features. She smiled at him as she sipped her coffee, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake smiled back with no hesitation. "I'm proud of you, Jake," she said quietly, breaking the silence between them. "I know it's been a difficult road, but you've come so far. I can see it in your eyes." Jake's throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't find the words. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he wished they could have shared, all those years ago. But instead he simply nodded, his heart full. "I'm sorry, Mum," he said finally, his voice low. "I'm sorry for everything. I know I've hurt you. And I've hurt myself too." His mother reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "Jake, I've forgiven you a long time ago. You just needed to forgive yourself." The weight that had been pressing down on Jake for so long seemed to lift in that moment. The years of guilt, of shame, that had once kept him stuck in the past, suddenly felt like they had no hold over him. He had been carrying them for so long, but he was ready to put them down. "I don't know what the future holds," Jake said, a small smile creeping onto his face. "But I know I want to make it right. For both of us." Life continued to surprise Jake in ways he never anticipated. One evening, as he sat at his usual spot at the cafe, sipping his coffee and reflecting on the events of the past few months, his phone buzzed. It was an unfamiliar number, and for a moment he hesitated, but something told him to answer. "Hello?" Jake said cautiously. "Hey, Jake," a familiar voice said on the other end of the line. It was Keanu. "I know this is a bit out of the blue, but I've been thinking. I've got this idea, and I think it could be something really great for you. You're doing amazing things with the community center, but what if you could take it further? What if you could start a program, help people beyond just those in the local area?" Jake's heart raced. He had never expected Keanu to reach out like this. The last time they spoke, Keanu had left a huge impression on him, and now the idea of taking things further felt like an opportunity he couldn't ignore. "You mean like a bigger project?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Exactly," Keanu replied. "I think you've got the passion and the heart to do something much bigger. You've got a unique story, and people will connect with it. So what, do you say? I've got some contacts who can help you get started. It's time to take your message to a broader audience." Jake took a deep breath. This was the opportunity he had always dreamed of, but now it felt so much more meaningful. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about giving others the chance to transform their lives just as he had. "I'm in," Jake said, a sense of certainty in his voice. "Let's do it." The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, brainstorming sessions and planning. With Keanu's help, Jake was able to set up a program aimed at helping individuals struggling with anger, addiction, and self-worth. They called it Second Chances, a place where people could come together to heal, to rebuild, and to learn how to forgive, not just others, but themselves. The program gained momentum quickly. People from all walks of life, young and old, from all parts of the city, showed up, eager to make a change. Jake found himself in the role of mentor, guiding others with the wisdom he had gained from his own journey. It wasn't always easy, but it was the most fulfilling work he had ever done. As the months went by, Jake found himself becoming part of a new family. It wasn't just about the people who came to the program, it was about the relationships he had rebuilt and the ones he had yet to form. His mother attended some of the sessions, watching him interact with others and seeing firsthand how much he had changed. She was proud of him, but more than that, she was in awe of the person he had become. He also continued to stay close to the friends he had made in the community center, especially Tom, who had once been at a low point but was now working alongside Jake to help others. Their bond had grown stronger, and together they had become a powerful force for good in the community. And as for Keanu, he continued to be a quiet but steady presence in Jake's life, offering encouragement when needed and stepping back when Jake needed space to grow. Their friendship had become a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could lead to the most significant changes. Jake stood at the front of the community center one evening, looking out over a group of new faces who had come to start their journey. There were no flashy speeches or grand gestures. There was just Jake standing tall and proud, knowing that his story wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up every day with the intention to do better. The road ahead won't always be easy, Jake said to the group. But I promise you this, if you commit to change, if you choose to believe in yourself, you'll find a way through it. We're all in this together. As he spoke those words, Jake realized that the true power of transformation wasn't in the moments of great triumph, but in the quiet, consistent choices to keep going. And now, as he looked around at the faces before him, he knew that his journey had come full circle. Jake wasn't just a product of his past mistakes anymore. He was a living testament to the power of second chances and the incredible possibility of transformation. What about you? Have you ever had the chance to turn things around, to take control of your story and make it something new? We'd love to hear about your experiences with change, redemption, and growth. If you've been inspired by Jake's story, share your thoughts with us in the comments below. What has helped you on your journey to becoming the person you are today? And remember, if you haven't already, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories of transformation, hope, and the power of choosing change. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time.